The vast and ancient forest of the Shadowfang Pack was a place of deep, whispering shadows and sharp, unspoken rules. At the very bottom of everything, beneath the lowest-ranked warrior and the smallest pup, was Cora. Her name was rarely spoken, usually replaced with a snap of the fingers or a curt, Omega. She was less a person and more of a tool, a toy to be used and then forgotten until she was needed again. Her days were a blur of thankless tasks, scrubbing the stone floors of the great meeting hall until her knees ached, scraping burnt scraps from the bottom of cooking pots, and mending torn tunics for warriors who wouldn't even glance in her direction. Her small room was little more than a closet tucked away near the smelly kennels, a space so insignificant that most of the pack forgot it existed. It was in this tiny, cold space that Cora's only true escape happened. When she finally collapsed onto her thin mattress each night, she would dream. And her dreams were not ordinary. They were vivid, colorful visions that felt more real than her waking life. Lately, one dream returned again and again. A man tall and imposing, with eyes the color of a stormy sky, filled with a loneliness so profound it made Cora's heart ache. He stood on a balcony overlooking a magnificent palace, a crown of twisted silver resting on his brow, but his shoulders were slumped under a weight she could feel even in her sleep. The air in the pack grounds crackled with a nervous energy one morning. He is coming. The Alpha King himself. The whispers flew from wolf to wolf. The Alpha King Roran was a legend, a ruler of unimaginable power who commanded all the packs in the territory. His visit was an honor and a terror. 4 days the pack worked frantically to prepare and Cora's work doubled. She was run ragged, fetching and carrying, polishing and cleaning, all under the sharp, cruel eye of Beta Brock. Brock was a mountain of a man with a mean streak as wide as he was. He took special pleasure in Cora's misery, seeing her low status as a personal challenge to his own power. The day of the king's arrival, he had her running errands non-stop, ensuring she was always in sight, a living reminder of his control over every aspect of the pack. Faster Omega. The king does not tolerate sloth, he would bark, a nasty grin on his face. When the horns blew, signaling the king's approach, the entire pack lined up in the main clearing. Cora was shoved to the very back, hidden behind taller, more important pack members. She peeked through the forest of legs and saw him. King Roran. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, with broad shoulders and a stern, unsmiling face. His eyes, that stormy gray from her dreams, scanned the crowd, and for a heartbeat Cora felt like they paused on her. A shiver, not entirely of fear, went down her spine. He was even more intimidating in person, his power a physical force that pressed down on the entire clearing. A great feast was held in the king's honor in the large, smoky longhouse. The fire roared, laughter and loud talk filled the air, and the smell of roasting meat was thick. Cora's role was to serve, to be invisible unless called upon. She weaved through the tables with a heavy pitcher of ale, refilling cups, her head bowed. Beta Brock, already drunk on both power and drink, watched her like a hawk. He saw his chance to impress the king with his absolute authority. "You, Omega," he bellowed, silencing the conversations around him. "The king's platter is empty. Bring the roasted boar. Now." The platter was enormous, a huge slab of wood laden with the heaviest part of the animal, its juices pooling underneath. Cora's arms strained as she lifted it from the central table. The weight was immense. She took slow, careful steps, her focus entirely on not dropping it in front of everyone. As she passed Brock's table, he casually stuck out his foot. It was so simple, so effortless. The toe of his boot caught her ankle. Cora cried out as her legs went out from under her. The massive platter flew from her hands, crashing to the floor with a tremendous clatter. Meat, fat and greasy juices splattered across the clean rushes and onto the boots of nearby warriors. For a second there was dead silence. Then the laughter started. It wasn't kind laughter, it was mocking, cruel, the sound of a crowd enjoying the humiliation of the weakest among them. Heat flooded Cora's cheeks as she scrambled on her hands and knees, trying desperately to gather the ruined food, her eyes stinging with tears of shame. The laughter died as suddenly as it began. King Roran rose from his seat at the head of the table. He did not shout. He did not need to. His presence alone commanded absolute silence. His stormy eyes were fixed not on the mess but on Cora. He saw the tears she desperately tried to blink away, the tremble in her hands, the quiet dignity with which she endured the humiliation. He saw the strength it took to not break down completely. Then his gaze shifted to Brock, who was still smirking. The king's expression turned to ice. He took a step forward, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. "In all my territories," he began, each word sharp and precise, I see strength. I see weakness. But I do not tolerate cruelty to those who cannot defend themselves." He looked down at Cora, who froze on the floor, terrified of what punishment the king himself would decree. But his next words were not for her. They were for Brock and for the entire pack. "This ends now. This Omega is under my protection. She will return with me to the royal palace. She will learn what it means to live in a place where strength is not used to break others, but to build them up." The silence in the hall was now one of pure shock. An Omega? Claimed by the Alpha King? It was unheard of. Brock's face was a mask of fury and disbelief, but he dared not speak against the king's direct order. Cora could only stare up at the powerful king, her mind reeling. Her life, her miserable, predictable life, had just been overturned in an instant. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. Was this a rescue? Or was she simply being taken from a small cage to a much larger, more gilded one? As two of the king's guards gently helped her to her feet, all she could do was follow, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, leaving the only life she had ever known behind. The journey to the royal palace was a blur of towering trees and unfamiliar landscapes seen from the window of a sleek, black car. Cora sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, trying to make herself as small as possible. King Roran sat across from her, his presence filling the space with a tense, silent energy. He didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the world passing by outside, his brow furrowed in thought. Cora dared not make a sound, convinced that at any moment he would realize his mistake, this strange act of mercy, and turn the car around to send her back to the humiliation she knew. When the car finally passed through immense wrought iron gates and the palace came into view, Cora's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a building, it was a mountain of pale, elegant stone, with towers that seemed to scratch the sky and windows that glittered like 1,000 eyes. It was beautiful and terrifying in its grandeur, a world away from the rough-hewn timber and mud of the Shadowfang longhouse. The car stopped, and a woman with kind eyes and a stern posture, introduced as Sylvia, the head of the royal guard, opened her door. "Come with me, miss," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. King Roran simply nodded to Sylvia and strode away without a backward glance, his long cloak sweeping behind him, leaving Cora feeling more alone than ever. Sylvia led her not to a dungeon or a servant's quarters in some dusty basement, but through gleaming hallways lined with portraits and intricate tapestries, up a sweeping marble staircase to a wooden door. She opened it to reveal a room that made Cora's eyes widen. It was larger than her entire old home. A real bed with a thick, soft-looking mattress and a heap of blankets stood against one wall. A window with actual glass panes looked out over a vast, moonlit garden. There was a small desk and a bookshelf that was empty, waiting. "This is your room," Sylvia stated. "You will rest tonight. Tomorrow you will begin your duties in the royal library. King Roran's orders." The library. The words echoed in Cora's mind long after Sylvia left. A library was a place of quiet and knowledge, a place she had only ever dreamed of being allowed to enter, let alone work in. It was the opposite of scrubbing floors and scraping pots. The next morning, after a sleep so deep and comfortable on the real bed that she felt disoriented, another she-wolf brought her new clothes. They were simple, a soft gray tunic and dark pants, but they were clean, well-made, and most importantly they were hers. No one else's cast-offs. Sylvia herself took Cora to the library, and the sight that greeted her was enough to make her forget her fear for a moment. The room was cavernous, with ceilings so high they were lost in shadow. Shelves upon shelves of books stretched away into the distance, smelling of old paper, leather, and wisdom. Her task, she was told, was to organize a section of historical records that had fallen into disarray. It was quiet, solitary work. Perfect. Days settled into a new, strange rhythm. Cora would wake in her beautiful room, eat a simple meal in the large, noisy kitchen where the other staff mostly ignored her, and then spend hours in the peaceful silence of the library, carefully dusting, sorting, and cataloging the ancient books. It was a peaceful cage, but a cage nonetheless. She was constantly aware of her place, the lowest-ranked creature in the most powerful place in the land. She kept her head down, spoke to no one, and lived in constant dread of crossing paths with the king. King Roran was a ghost in his own palace, a figure of immense power who was rarely seen but always felt. Cora would sometimes catch a glimpse of him striding through a distant hallway, his face a mask of stern concentration, always surrounded by advisors and warriors discussing weighty matters of state. He never looked at her. She began to wonder if he had forgotten her entirely, if she was just another piece of furniture he had acquired on a trip and then left to gather dust. But then the dreams returned. They were sharper now, more intense. She saw him not as a king on a throne, but as a man, standing alone on a balcony, the weight of his crown seeming to physically press him down. She felt his loneliness as if it were her own, a deep, hollow ache that echoed the one in her own heart. In one dream she saw him in a specific part of the moonlit gardens, beneath a giant, weeping willow tree, his head in his hands. The next evening, drawn by a force she didn't understand, Cora found herself walking in those very gardens. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming flowers. The moon was a sharp sliver in the violet sky. And there, just as in her dream, was King Roran. He stood under the willow tree, one hand resting on its ancient trunk, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the moonlight. He looked tired. Not the powerful, untouchable king, but just a man. She meant to turn back, to slip away unseen, but her foot snapped a twig. The sound was like a thunderclap in the quiet evening. Roran turned, his stormy eyes finding her immediately. Cora froze, her heart hammering, expecting a reprimand for intruding on his private moment. But he didn't shout. He just looked at her for a long, silent moment. "Do you ever feel it?" he asked, his voice quieter, rougher than she'd ever heard it. "The weight of all these eyes? The weight of every single person who depends on you? You can be in a room full of people and feel completely alone." The question was so unexpected, so honest, that it broke through Cora's fear. She thought of her life, always surrounded by pack, yet always an outsider. Always alone. She found her voice, a soft whisper. "All the time." He took a step closer, studying her face as if seeing it for the first time. "The library. The work is acceptable? It is peaceful." "Thank you," Cora replied, her courage growing slightly. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. A mind that enjoys peace is a rare thing in these loud halls. He was looking at her not as an omega, not as a servant, but as a person. The air between them felt different, charged with a new, unspoken understanding. For the first time, Cora didn't feel the urge to run from him. She felt curious. The scary Alpha King was gone, and in his place was just Roran, a lonely man in a moonlit garden. And as he looked at her, a strange, warm feeling began to uncoil deep within her chest, a feeling that was entirely her own, yet somehow also connected to him. The quiet understanding in the moonlit garden did not magically transform Cora's life. The sun rose the next morning on the same majestic palace, and she returned to the same hushed, book-lined sanctuary of the library. Yet everything felt different. The air itself seemed to hum with a new, unspoken potential. The fear that had been her constant companion since arriving began to slowly recede, like a tide going out, leaving behind curiosity and a fragile, budding sense of something else, a connection. King Roran too seemed subtly changed. His patrols through the palace, once a cause for Cora to duck behind a bookshelf, now often saw his path divert through the library's vast, silent halls. He would pause, not with the air of a king inspecting a servant's work, but as a man appreciating a place of quiet. He would ask her simple, direct questions. "The histories of the northern packs, have you found them yet? Or, is the system you are using for cataloging effective?" His voice was still deep, still carried the weight of command, but it had lost its sharp, cutting edge when he spoke to her. Cora, emboldened by the memory of his vulnerability under the willow tree, began to answer with more than just yes or no. She found herself explaining her method of organization, pointing out a fascinating passage she'd discovered in a crumbling text, even once gently correcting a minor historical detail he mentioned about a past treaty. She held her breath after, waiting for the rebuke for her boldness. It never came. Instead he listened. His intense, stormy eyes would fix on her, truly listening, and a flicker of something, interest, respect, surprise, would cross his features. He began to see the sharp, curious mind that had been hidden beneath the bowed head and fearful eyes of the Omega. He saw not a rank but a person named Cora. For Cora, the stern, untouchable king began to dissolve, replaced by the figure of Roran. She observed him not with fear, but with a growing fascination. She saw how he presided over meetings in the Great Hall, his justice firm but fair. She heard stories from Sylvia of how he personally ensured the weakest members of his own pack were cared for, how he valued loyalty and honesty above brute strength. The weight he carried was not just for show, it was real and he bore it alone. Her fear slowly melted into a different, warmer emotion, a deep and startling care for this lonely man who ruled a kingdom. The change between them was a slow, steady burn, like embers glowing brighter and brighter, but it was leading towards an inevitable flashpoint. It happened on a rainy afternoon. The library was dark and cozy, the sound of the rain a gentle drumming against the high windows. Cora was perched on a small wooden ladder, trying to reach a heavy leather-bound volume on a top shelf. Her fingers brushed the spine, but it was wedged tightly. She stretched further, straining on her toes. Suddenly, a presence was behind her. She didn't need to turn. She felt him, the warmth and the powerful energy that announced Roran. "Allow me," his voice rumbled close to her ear. He reached up, his arm brushing against her side, and easily dislodged the book. As he handed it down to her, their fingers touched. It was not like any touch Cora had ever experienced. It was as if a bolt of lightning, pure and white-hot, shot straight up her arm and exploded in her chest. The book nearly tumbled from her suddenly numb fingers. A gasp escaped her lips, and her eyes, wide with shock, flew to his. He had frozen completely, his own hand still outstretched. His stormy eyes were wide, the gray darkening with a storm of a different kind, one of pure, unadulterated recognition. The air crackled around them, thick and heavy with a power that was not his alone, but theirs together. In that single electric touch, the silent, patient bond that had been weaving itself between them since the hall in Shadowfang Pack snapped taut, undeniable and terrifyingly real. The moment was shattered by the loud, impatient clearing of a throat. They both jumped, the spell broken, and turned to see a palace guard standing at the library entrance. "My king, a visitor demands an audience. Beta Brock of the Shadowfang Pack. He says it is urgent." The name was like a dash of cold water. The warmth and shock in Roran's eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, hard glint of the Alpha King. The moment of connection was over, but its echo vibrated through Cora's entire being. She followed at a distance as Roran strode to the grand receiving hall, her heart now pounding for a different reason. Brock stood in the center of the marble floor, looking out of place and bristling with arrogance. His eyes scanned the room with disdain before landing on Cora, who hovered near a pillar. A nasty smirk twisted his lips. He gave a shallow, disrespectful bow to Roran. "My king. I come on behalf of the Shadowfang Pack. There is a matter of a stolen item. A valuable silver dagger. It went missing on the day of your visit, and it has come to our attention that the only one unaccounted for during the commotion was the Omega." He pointed a thick finger directly at Cora. "She was always a sneaky, dishonest creature. We demand she be returned to face our justice for her theft." The accusation hung in the air, vile and poisonous. Cora's blood ran cold. It was a lie, a perfect, cruel lie designed to drag her back. But before she could even form a denial, before she could even breathe, a sound filled the hall that made the very stones tremble. It was a low, deep, vicious growl that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It came from Roran. His eyes were no longer gray, they glowed with a fierce, fiery red. His power erupted from him, not the controlled authority of a king, but the raw, primal fury of an alpha defending what was his. The force of it was so strong that Brock physically took a step back, his smirk vanishing, replaced by pale fear. Roran took a single, menacing step forward. "You," Roran's voice was a guttural snarl, barely human, "will not speak her name. You will not look in her direction. You will not bring your filth and your lies into my hall." Each word was a hammer blow. "She is under my protection. That is the only law that matters here. You will leave this palace now, and if you ever speak of her again without the respect she is owed, I will personally ensure you understand the true meaning of regret." Brock was cowed, his bravado completely evaporated. He mumbled something, gave a terrified bow, and almost scrambled out of the hall under the glare of the king and his guards. The moment he was gone, the crushing pressure of Roran's power receded. He stood there, chest heaving, the red glow slowly fading from his eyes. He turned those eyes, now just stormy and intense, on Cora. He hadn't said the words, "She is my mate," but his actions, his explosive, protective fury, had screamed it to the entire world. And in that moment, looking at the man who had just defended her with the ferocity of a wolf defending its heart, Cora knew. The warm care in her chest bloomed into something brighter, hotter, and undeniable. Was love. The silence in the grand hall after Brock's terrified retreat was heavier than any noise. The air still vibrated with the echo of King Roran's fury, a primal energy that had shaken the very stones of the palace. Cora stood frozen by the pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could still feel the ghost of that electric touch in the library, a stark contrast to the cold fear Brock's accusation had brought. But that fear was now completely burned away, replaced by an awe so profound it stole her breath. He had not just defended her. He had unleashed a part of himself, the raw, untamed alpha, to shield her. No one had ever done that. No one had ever even cared enough to stand in front of a thrown pebble for her, let alone the full force of a beta's malice. Roran turned from the doorway through which Brock had fled. The terrifying alpha rage was receding from his features, leaving behind an intensity that was just as powerful but far more focused. His stormy eyes found hers across the vast space, and he began to walk toward her. Each step was deliberate, measured. The few guards and servants in the hall discreetly vanished, sensing the profound privacy of the moment unfolding. He did not stop until he was standing right before her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "This cannot wait," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to speak directly to her soul. "Not for another moment." He did not reach for her hand, but instead offered his own, palm up, an invitation. "Will you walk with me?" Wordlessly, her own hand trembling slightly, she placed her fingers in his. A new, softer jolt passed between them, not of shock, but of rightness. His large hand closed around hers, warm and sure, and he led her from the hall, through the quiet corridors, and out into the moon-drenched gardens. The same gardens where they had first truly spoken. The weeping willow tree was there, its leaves shimmering silver in the light. He led her to the very spot and finally turned to face her, both her hands now enveloped in his. "Cora," he began, and the way he said her name, with a reverence she had never heard from anyone, made her eyes well with tears. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people. Advisors, warriors, subjects. I have sat on a throne of power and commanded armies. And I have never felt more alone than in the middle of a crowded room." He took a deep breath, his thumbs gently stroking the backs of her hands. "I thought a mate would be a queen, a symbol of strength to stand beside me. I was a fool. The moon goddess, in her infinite wisdom, did not send me a queen. She sent me my other half. She sent me you." He released one of her hands to gently tilt her chin up, forcing her to look into his eyes, which were now soft and full of a vulnerable honesty that shook her to her core. "In that hall when I saw you being mistreated, something in me broke. And then something else awoke. It was not just anger, Cora. It was the most profound need to protect what is mine. You are not my toy. You were never anyone's toy. You are the most strong, kind, and wise person I have ever known. You are my mate. My true Luna. Not because of a title, but because your heart is the only thing strong enough to rule beside mine. Will you accept me?" The tears she had been holding back spilled over, tracing warm paths down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a joy so complete it was overwhelming. All the loneliness, the pain, the feeling of being less than nothing, it all melted away in the warmth of his words, in the certainty shining in his eyes. Her wolf, always so quiet and hidden, surged forward with a joyful whine, pressing against her skin, yearning for him. She saw not a king but her Roran. Her mate. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of her entire world. "Yes, Roran. I accept you." A smile, a true, breathtaking smile, broke across his face, transforming his stern features into something beautiful. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She rose onto her toes to meet him. Their first kiss was not a claiming of power but a sealing of a promise. It was soft and searching, a gentle exploration that spoke of tenderness and a love that had been waiting for them both for a lifetime. It felt like coming home, like finding the missing piece of herself she never knew was lost. When they finally parted, breathless, Roran's eyes glowed with a soft, silver light. He whispered her name again like a prayer before he leaned in, nuzzling his face against the curve of her neck. His breath was warm on her skin. Then, with a tenderness that belied his strength, he pressed his lips to the spot where her neck met her shoulder, and he bit down. It was not a harsh bite, but a precise, claiming pressure that sent a wave of pure, white-hot pleasure through her entire body, not pain. It was the final thread snapping into place, the completion of the bond that had been weaving itself around them since the beginning. In that moment she could feel him, not just his hands holding her but his presence in her mind, a warm, strong, protective glow that she knew would be there forever. Their souls were now irrevocably intertwined. Weeks later, the entire palace and packs from all across the territory gathered in the immense royal courtyard. Sunlight streamed down, glittering off jewels and fine clothes. Cora stood before the assembled crowd, but she did not feel afraid. She was dressed in a gown of deep midnight blue, and on her brow rested a delicate crown of twisted silver, meant to mirror Roran's own. She was no longer the girl in a dirty tunic. She held her head high. Roran stood before her, his voice powerful and clear, carrying to every ear. Today we do not crown a queen because of birthright or power. Today we crown a Luna because of heart. I present to you your Luna, Cora. My equal, my mate, and my heart. The cheer that rose from the crowd was thunderous, not of obligation but of genuine joy and acceptance. As Roran took her hand and raised it high, Cora looked out at the sea of faces at her pack, and then at the man beside her. The lonely king and the rejected Omega were gone. In their place stood two halves of a single soul, rulers bound by love and respect, their lonely journeys finally over. They had found their home in each other, and together, they would build a future brighter than any they could have imagined alone. If you were swept away by the journey of Cora and Roran, if you felt the spark of their connection and the strength of their bond, then you won't want to miss what happens next in their world. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you tales of love that conquers all, of fierce protectors and the strong hearts who tame them. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss a single story. Dive into a universe where every click brings a new adventure, a new romance, a new escape. Join our growing pack of listeners and become part of our story. Subscribe today.